Could this be the beginning of the end of the buy-to-let sector? Any benefits of being a landlord have slowly been eroded away over the years, and now with the introduction of the Renters Reform Bill, this could be the final nail in the coffin for many buy-to-let landlords. Forget the idea of having a level playing field between tenants and landlords. This is like playing football on a hill with you at the bottom trying to defend those goals. The question is, are you staying as a landlord, or are you now packing your bags and getting out of the landlord sector? Hey, if you're watching my videos for the first time, my name is Saj Hussain, and on this channel I share with you my 15 plus years of property investing experience to ultimately help you get further faster in your own property investing business. Now, the government plans to reform the rental sector and try and make it much more fairer for tenants, which on the face of it should be a really good thing, right? But what I think would make it even better if they included landlords in that and made it fairer for them too. What is it that's led up to this current situation? Well, there used to be a time where the Conservative Party would support landlords and encourage the ownership of property for rental purposes and effectively bring more rental stock to the market. But over the years, they seem to have realised there's a lot more tenants than there is landlords, i.e. there's a lot more votes available from the rental sector than there is from the people that own the property in that sector. And slowly that seems to be a shift away from supporting landlords to favouring tenants. And rather than just supporting tenants, they've shifted their views to more anti-landlord rhetoric that's been coming out from the Tory party over the last few years. Now, don't get me wrong, I think the rental sector does need reforming. There's some very archaic ideas in there in terms of how it's run and how it operates, but I think it needs to be more fairer for everybody involved, rather than making it much more in favour for tenants and leaving out the suppliers to the sector, i.e. the landlords. In February 2022, the government published a levelling up white paper with its recommitment to introducing the Renters Reform Bill, which is talking about changing how renting works. In principle, a great idea. Then in May 2022, in the government's Queen's speech, it promised that the Renters Reform Bill would abolish Section 21, i.e. the no-fault evictions. Now, there's some merit in doing that, but it also needs to be balanced and done in a more fair way, because you need to review the whole system rather than something in isolation. Then in June 2022, the government published a white paper called A Fairer Private Rented Sector, the one behind me just here, and in that it talks about and lays out the plans for the Renters Reform Bill in more detail. The government has also expressed its desire to debate and vote in this bill within this parliamentary session, which means this all could be happening very, very soon. There are 8 key proposals within this bill, some of them good, some of them, let's face it, really not so good for landlords at all. Let's now jump straight in and talk about those 8 and how they impact you as a landlord. The first key proposal is the abolishment of the Section 21 process. Sometimes people refer this as to a no-fault eviction. Essentially, it's a process to be able to get a property back by a landlord without having any particular reason in terms of why they want the property back from a tenant. Now, the government's own data shows that between 2019 and 2020, more than 20% of the tenants that moved did not end their tenancy by choice. So let's put some context into this in terms of why the Section 1 document is used by landlords. When a landlord creates a property to be rented out and brings it into the marketplace as a product, effectively their longer term intention is to rent that property out and create a rental income from that, hold that asset for the long term, maybe for their pension, maybe even their kids might be able to benefit from the hard work and the effort they've put in and the risk they've taken in acquiring that property and bringing it to the market. However, there will be times when there's an issue with a tenant, and often it's around non-payment of rent or antisocial behaviour. There's some kind of challenge or difficulty with that tenant. Now, the normal process is to use a Section 8 notice to be able to remove that tenant. However, the Section 8 is not so easy to use, and it can be quite challenging sometimes getting that process through court, and it could drag on for quite a long time. So what some landlords will do, and we've done this ourselves as well, we use a Section 21 route, which means we ask for a no-fault eviction, and that means without giving a reason we look for the property back, simply because it's an easier route to achieve the same outcome rather than going through what would be the correct process, because it's much more cumbersome and an unreliable way to get the outcome that we want. So in short, landlords don't go around evicting tenants. What they want is a property rented out to a tenant who's going to look after it and pay the rent on time. And the only time they do evict a tenant if there's a problem with that tenant. The second proposal is minimum housing standards. Now, I'm in favour of this because I think it's important that the accommodation that we provide should be of good quality. So this is extending the decent home standard into the private renting sector. As I said, I think this is important. This is something that really should happen, and it's something that should have happened a long time ago, because we really shouldn't expect anybody to live in substandard housing. Proposal number 3 is for periodic tenancies to become standard. Effectively what that means, there'll be no more fixed period of 6-month tenancies. They'll effectively be like a rolling tenancy. So when a tenancy comes out of a fixed period, it becomes periodic, and that will be the standard way tenancy agreements are put together. And effectively a tenancy then can't be ended by a landlord without a valid reason, and the tenant can stay as long as they want. Now, the theory behind that makes sense. However, my concern is it being open to abuse. So depending on how it's set up and how it works, it could be that this works really well, or it's just massively abused. For example, a tenant could stop paying rent and choose to move because they feel that the housing is of poor quality. The question is, how do you define that? And of course, sometimes, we've experienced as well, where a tenant can be manipulative in terms of getting a situation to work in their favor. So as long as this works in a fair way, I think this is a great idea. Proposal number 4 is a new ombudsman covering all private landlords. So the current system will effectively change to cover all landlords to be a member of an ombudsman scheme. So if there's any disputes or issues, that can go to the ombudsman service. And again, as long as this is done in a fair way, I don't really see any issue with this. I think that's great news. However, my only slight gripe with this is, when are we going to see a system that also means that tenants have to register and tenants have to meet certain standards as well, rather than just landlords are the ones that are having to adhere to various rules and standards? Proposal number 5 is for tenants to be given more rights to keep pets in properties. Now, on the face of it, again, I don't really have an issue with this in them and keeping pets. If they're goldfish, there's no real issue at all. If it's a 6-foot alligator, then that can be a bit of a challenge, because there's no real description of what pets are, what size pet is reasonable or not. Of course, having some animals in the house can cause much more damage than others. Yes, there'll be a requirement to have pet insurance, but sometimes enforcing these things can be a real pain in the backside. So although I agree that a tenant should have a right to be able to have a pet within the property, it also needs to be balanced with what damage that pet potentially could cause in that property as well. Proposal number 6 is a new property portal for private landlords and tenants as well. So what this will mean is a central place where all the information is kept. Now, I think this is a great idea, because sometimes what happens with legal information when we go look at it, particularly around the rental sector, when it comes to licensing and planning and various things, often you find it scattered around, it's not in one place. But if we've got information held in one place which is relevant to landlords and relevant to tenants for rental of residential property, I think that will make things a whole lot easier. Proposal number 7 is to prevent landlords from not renting to families with children, and also excluding families and people that are on DSS benefits, or sometimes you see as no DSS type of adverts. Again, I think generally this is a good idea. I think it's important to take into consideration why it is that some landlords choose not to rent to families or choose not to rent to people on benefits. Well, when it comes to not renting on families, for me, that doesn't really make sense. I think renting a property to a family with children, for us generally, we don't have no issue with that. But when it comes to not renting to, for example, people that are on benefits, often there could be reasons of security around that in terms of how payments are made, and our payments are going to be made on time. And as long as that system's tightened up and a landlord is going to get paid the rent on time and there's no issues, then certainly there's no issues around that. So this comes down to really the ability to pay, which I think is important, which sometimes the system, the way it operates right now, is very weak. So we don't exclude people that are on benefits from renting from us, but what we do look for is some guarantors and some security to ensure that we're going to get paid the rent as and when it's due. Proposal number 8 is to double the time frame, the notice period required for a landlord to give notice to a tenant to increase the rent at a property. But more importantly, to give a tenant the right to object if they think it's unfair, the level of increase that's happening. Now, I don't know any tenant that likes to get a rent increase, so I can see a lot of tenants objecting to that and causing delays and problems. There needs to be a more balanced and fairer way of how rent increases work. So for example, retail price index annually, as that increases, it can be pegged to a percentage of that. Inflation, right now inflation is through the roof, so it might not be the best thing, but there needs to be some method where rent increases happen, and reason rent increases happen because market conditions dictate there's an increase in the rent. So if it's pegged to something, it would make sense, but when it isn't, then again it's open to abuse. So a lot of these things are good ideas on the surface, but a lot of it is going to depend on, the devil really is going to be in the detail in terms of how these things are going to work and how it's going to get implemented. My real concerns are many of these things haven't really been thought through by the government in terms of how they're going to play out, what the impact they're going to have. So for example, the removing of Section 21, which means we can't evict a tenant without any justification or any reason, then those changes really need to be built into the current Section 8 system, which they've talked about they're going to do, but really again, there's no detail. And the frustration is when a tenant's not paying rent, it takes months and months. So for example, let's say you got a rent of £500 a month and it takes, say, 6 months to get somebody out, and often it can take much longer. That landlord is thousands and thousands of pounds of out of pocket, and many landlords are not really in a position to absorb those kind of losses. And you can see where the chances of abuse and increase in problems like that might happen for them, where some landlords will simply throw in the towel and say, enough is enough, I no longer want to be a landlord. And what that is doing is taking property property away from the rental sector, and the government is not fulfilling this gap. They're not putting new rental property stock into the marketplace. So what ultimately will happen, will be fewer and fewer properties in the marketplace available for rent. And so rather than getting landlords involved in trying to make a better sector for everybody, they're marginalizing them really in favor for tenants, but there'll only be so much that landlords are willing to accept. So for instance, we talk about having decent homes and a good standard, which I think is really important. But at the same time, if you cap rent increases, for example, rents can't be increased beyond certain numbers. Again, we've yet to see the detail of how this is going to play out, but I can see how that's going to get pulled back and there'll be a limited amount of rent increases that can happen. Then what you're doing, you're preventing a landlord from being able to generate profit on their property. So for instance, if their mortgage rates are going up like they are right now, their profit margin is being squeezed because the rent remains the same, but their costs are increasing. Now, if that was to happen, you can see why a landlord would choose not to spend money on a property, because they're not making enough money. It's not really viable for them to do that. So rather than encouraging landlords to create nice and decent homes, what you're doing is squeezing the margin of landlords to a point where they don't want to spend money, and there may be some landlords who start even cutting corners, which I don't think is a good thing, but you can see how all these things are going to happen. So unfortunately, rather than creating a more fairer system for everybody, right now what's happening is the system is becoming much more in the favor of tenants. It's not really a fair system at the expense of landlords. Hey, look, I'd love to know what your thoughts are on this topic. I'd like to think that I have a fairly balanced opinion on this, but many people might think I'm biased with the view of a landlord and the opinion there. Really what I want to do is to see a more fair system for everybody in the rental sector, for this to thrive, for tenants to have great homes in a reasonable rent that they're paying, for landlords to be able to create profit in what they're doing, so they continue to invest in the sector and make it grow. Hey, if you've enjoyed this content, what to do next is click on my face over here to subscribe to the channel. Once you've done that, then click on here to watch this video next, where I talk about evictions, interest rate rises, which is a vlog I did earlier in the year in February 2022, where also the infamous eviction expert Paul Champlin was on stage at one of our events. So watch this video next and I'll see you there.